The initial American aviators who engaged Japanese Zeros over the Pacific during early 1942 returned with accounts that seemed exaggerated yet carried grave seriousness. They reported an adversary fighter capable of outmaneuvering every aircraft the United States Navy or Army Air Forces could deploy. The Mitsubishi A6M0 wasn't merely competent, it was frighteningly superior. American pilots were paying with their lives. On February 20th, 1942, during Japan's initial aerial assault on Darwin, Australia, 9 Zeros protecting bombers confronted a hastily assembled group of P-40 Warhawks. The confrontation lasted mere minutes. The Zeros eliminated 4 P-40s without suffering a single loss. Surviving American pilots consistently reported the same frustrating pattern whenever they attempted to outmaneuver a Zero to achieve targeting position. The Japanese fighter simply executed tighter turns, slipped inside their turning circle, and positioned itself behind them. It resembled attempting to outperform a ballet dancer while wearing weighted footwear. The statistics from those initial months were devastating. Across the Philippines, Wake Island, and throughout the Dutch East Indies, American fighter pilots confronted a straightforward mathematical challenge. The Zero could execute a complete 360-degree turn in approximately 16 seconds at combat velocities. The F-4F Wildcat, America's primary carrier-based fighter, required about 19 seconds. The P-40 Warhawk needed even longer. 3 seconds might appear insignificant until realizing that during turning combat, those 3 seconds enabled the Zero to complete its turn, establish firing position, and deliver 20mm cannon rounds into your cockpit while you remained struggling to align your aircraft with empty sky. But numerical data only reveals part of the narrative. The Zero achieved its extraordinary turning capability through radical design principles. Japanese engineers constructed an aircraft weighing just 5,300 pounds empty, approximately two-thirds the mass of an F-4F Wildcat. They accomplished this weight reduction by eliminating nearly all protective armor for the pilot and fuel containers. No self-sealing fuel tanks, minimal protective plating behind the cockpit. The Zero essentially represented a powerful engine encased in fragile material, exchanging survivability for pure maneuverability. American pilots remained unaware of this reality, yet they certainly experienced the consequences. Every encounter followed a predictable sequence. American pilots would identify Zeros, descend to attack, potentially release a burst of gunfire, then the Zeros would turn to engage. The moment an American pilot attempted turning combat, maneuvering his aircraft in a horizontal circle to track the adversary, he had already lost. The Zero would simply outmaneuver him, transitioning from defender to attacker within seconds. Experienced pilots developed a sinking sensation while pulling back on the control stick, recognizing they were entering a contest they couldn't win. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Flatley characterized the situation in March 1942 following engagements near Guadalcanal. It's not that our men lack bravery or ability. They possess both abundantly. But they're attempting to combat according to established principles, and those principles no longer function. We're instructing them in dogfighting, in turning and burning, in maintaining engagement against the Zeros. That's instructing them to perish. His statements captured the core crisis confronting American naval aviation. The entire doctrine of air combat, developed through years of training and theory, had been invalidated within weeks. The crisis extended beyond individual pilot survival. Aerial superiority in the Pacific depended on prevailing in these fighter versus fighter engagements. If American fighters couldn't protect dive bombers and torpedo aircraft, carrier task forces couldn't effectively strike Japanese objectives. If fighters couldn't protect bases and bomber formations, America's offensive capacity disappeared. The Zero challenge wasn't solely about aerial combat. It endangered the entire strategic framework in the Pacific theater. Pilots began calling it Zero Fever. The chilling realization when engaged in turning combat with a Japanese fighter that your adversary would complete his turn before you. Some pilots froze. Others executed desperate maneuvers that worsened their situation. A few began thinking differently, and those individuals started noticing intriguing aspects of Zero behavior. Commander John Smith Jimmy Thatch confronted a problem that disturbed his sleep aboard the USS Lexington during early 1942. As commanding officer of Fighting Squadron 3, he bore responsibility for keeping his pilots alive while they faced an enemy aircraft that surpassed their Wildcats in nearly every measurable aspect. Thatch represented an unconventional naval officer for his era. He didn't merely fly, he analyzed. While other squadron commanders concentrated on gunnery practice and formation flying, Thatch devoted hours examining after-action reports, debriefing returning pilots, and performing calculations on scratch paper. By April 1942, Thatch had gathered sufficient data to clearly recognize the pattern. American pilots who survived Zero encounters shared common experiences. They described how Japanese pilots would lock onto targets and pursue them through turning engagements with nearly supernatural precision. Japanese pilots understood that their aircraft could outmaneuver any American plane, so they committed completely to the turn, tightening their radius, accepting greater G-forces, confident their quarry would exhaust turning capability first. This confidence became predictable, and predictability, Thatch realized, could be exploited. Thatch observed another element in debriefings that most officers dismissed as combat stress or confused memory. Multiple pilots reported that when they attempted radical maneuvers, sudden dives, unexpected climbs, or aggressive throttle reductions, Zero pilots occasionally appeared surprised. Japanese aviators had grown accustomed to American pilots combating in specific ways, turning, attempting to dogfight, following rules that favored the Zero. This expectation created tunnel vision. Zero pilots would commit to pursuit with such confidence that they ignored warning signs. They would follow American fighters into situations that more cautious pilots would recognize as traps. Thatch shared his observations with every squadron commander who would listen. He composed detailed tactical memoranda that circulated through the fleet. Some of his ideas were dismissed. Senior officers who had never confronted Zeros believed Thatch was overcomplicating basic fighter tactics. But pilots who had survived combat in the South Pacific studied Thatch's reports like sacred texts. Here was someone who understood what they faced and who was thinking systematically about solutions rather than simply demanding more courage or improved gunnery. The genuine test would arrive at Midway. The Thatch weave appeared absurd in theory. Naval aviation doctrine since World War I emphasized formation integrity, mutual support through defensive circles, and individual dogfighting prowess. Now, Thatch was instructing pilots to deliberately turn toward the enemy, to cross flight paths with wingmen at high velocity, and to trust that geometry and timing would save them instead of superior turning performance. It violated every instinct fighter pilots had developed. Thatch drilled his pilots relentlessly during the voyage to Midway in late May 1942. Two Wildcats would take off and practice the scissoring motion repeatedly. Turn toward each other, pass, turn back, pass again. The pattern created a woven defensive zone nearly impenetrable to a single attacker. But it demanded absolute precision. If timing deviated by even 1 second, the two Wildcats could collide. If one pilot hesitated or misjudged the crossing point, the weave collapsed and both aircraft became vulnerable. Thatch's pilots practiced until the maneuver became instinctive, until they could execute it while under fire with adrenaline surging and hands trembling. On June 4, 1942, the Battle of Midway provided the ultimate testing ground. Thatch led his division of 6 Wildcats as escort for torpedo bombers attacking the Japanese carrier fleet. At 0920 hours, Zeros swarmed the formation. Thatch witnessed his worst nightmare materializing, more than a dozen Zeros diving on his outnumbered Wildcats. He immediately initiated the weave with his wingman, Ensign Robert Ram Dib. A Zero attached itself to Thatch's tail and followed him into the turn with predictable aggression. The Japanese pilot flew exactly as Thatch had theorized, fully committed to pursuit, confident in his aircraft's superior turning ability, completely focused on the target ahead. Dib crossed before Thatch at a combined closing speed approaching 500 miles per hour. The Zero pilot suddenly found himself flying directly into Dib's gun sight with less than 2 seconds to react. Dib's .50 caliber machine guns shredded the unarmored Zero's airframe. The aircraft disintegrated. Thatch immediately reversed his turn, weaving back across Dib's flight path. Another Zero that had been pursuing Dib now confronted the same geometric problem. Thatch's guns aimed directly at it. The Zero pilot broke off, unwilling to fly into certain destruction. In under 30 seconds, the weave had destroyed one Zero and forced another to disengage. The engagement continued for nearly 20 minutes. Thatch's division maintained weaving, kept crossing, continued turning toward each other instead of away. The Zeros, accustomed to eliminating isolated American fighters, couldn't penetrate the formation. Each time a Zero committed to an attack, it encountered crossfire. Japanese pilots who had grown comfortable with American predictability suddenly faced something entirely novel. Some adapted and broke off. Others, locked into their attack mindset, pressed forward and died. When Thatch's division returned to the Yorktown, they had confirmed 3 Zero eliminations and driven off at least 5 others. More significantly, they had protected the torpedo bombers sufficiently for the attack to develop, even though the torpedo assault itself proved largely ineffective due to other tactical issues. News of the weave spread throughout the Pacific Fleet within days. Pilots who had felt helpless against Zeros now possessed a concrete defensive tactic that worked. But the weave represented something greater than just an ingenious maneuver. It fundamentally altered how American pilots conceptualized air combat. The old doctrine emphasized individual skill in aircraft performance. The new doctrine emphasized teamwork, tactical discipline, and exploiting adversary psychology. You didn't need to outmaneuver a Zero if you could outthink the Zero pilot. Fighter squadrons across the Pacific began adapting the weave to their specific requirements. Some versions employed 4 aircraft instead of 2, creating even more complex crossing patterns. Others modified timing and spacing based on whether they flew Wildcats, P-40s, or the new P-38 Lightnings beginning to arrive in the theater. The core principle remained constant. Turn toward your wingman, force the enemy to choose between breaking off or flying into gunfire, and never combat the way the enemy expects. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots proved significant. Intelligence reports from captured documents and interrogated prisoners revealed that Zero pilots had begun approaching combat more cautiously by late 1942. The easy victories of early 1942 had ended. American formations that weaved and scissored presented dangers that transcended simple numerical superiority. The Japanese tactical advantage, their aircraft's superior maneuverability, had been neutralized not through better engineering, but through superior thinking. While the Thatch weave solved the problem of Zero pursuit, it didn't address the fundamental question that continued troubling American fighter pilots. How do you combat an enemy you cannot outmaneuver without waiting to be attacked first? The answer emerged from an unexpected source: pilots who had survived by refusing to dogfight entirely. These pilots had discovered something that would become the cornerstone of American fighter doctrine for the remainder of the war: energy combat. Major John L. Smith of Marine Fighting Squadron 223 arrived at Guadalcanal's Henderson Field in August 1942 with a straightforward philosophy that he instilled in every pilot under his command. Quote, "Altitude is life, speed is life, turning is death." Smith had obsessively studied early combat reports and reached a conclusion that seemed almost cowardly to traditionally minded fighter pilots. Never under any circumstances turn with a zero. Instead, his pilots would utilize the one advantage their aircraft actually possessed: diving speed and structural strength. The physics were straightforward. A Wildcat weighed approximately 7,900 pounds fully loaded compared to the Zero's 5,300 pounds. In level flight at identical speed, both aircraft possessed equal kinetic energy. But in a dive, the heavier Wildcat accelerated faster and could achieve higher velocities before reaching structural limits. The Zero's lightweight construction, the same characteristic that enabled its beautiful turns, became a liability in vertical maneuvers. Zero pilots who dove too aggressively risked overstressing their airframes. American pilots in Wildcats, P-40s, and especially the rugged P-47 Thunderbolts arriving later could dive at speeds that would tear Zeros apart. Smith's pilots executed what became known as boom and zoom attacks. They would patrol at high altitude, typically 20,000 feet or higher, maintaining what pilots called an energy advantage. When they spotted Zeros below, they would dive at high velocity, fire a brief burst at the target, then utilize their diving speed to climb back to altitude before Zeros could react. The attack lasted seconds. If the burst connected, the Zero fell. If it missed, the American pilot didn't remain to observe. He converted his speed back to altitude and prepared for another attack. The Zeros below could turn and twist as they wished. They couldn't catch an aircraft that refused to combat in their arena. Captain Joe Foss, who would conclude the war as one of America's leading aces with 26 victories, characterized the energy combat doctrine bluntly during a November 1942 debriefing. Quote, "The Zero wants you to turn. That's his game. So don't play it. Stay above him. Stay fast. Strike him when he's not looking and depart before he can respond. It's not about being brave or proving you're a better pilot in a fair fight. It's about eliminating the enemy and returning home alive." End quote. Foss's statements captured the fundamental mindset shift occurring across the Pacific Theater. The concept of energy management extended deeper than simply diving and climbing. Pilots learned to conceptualize their aircraft as reservoirs of energy existing in two forms: kinetic energy from speed and potential energy from altitude. Every maneuver either expended energy or traded one form for another. A sharp turn depleted speed. It converted kinetic energy into angular momentum and through air resistance into waste heat. A climb traded kinetic energy for potential energy. A dive performed the reverse. The objective was maintaining higher total energy than your opponent, meaning you controlled engagement terms. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, who had earlier lamented traditional dogfighting tactics' inadequacy, became one of energy combat's most vocal advocates. By September 1942, he developed a training program using chalk talks and blackboard diagrams to teach pilots how to visualize energy states during combat. He would draw two aircraft and ask, "This Zero is at 15,000 feet, moving 180 knots. You're at 20,000 feet, moving 250 knots. Who possesses the energy advantage?" The answer was always the aircraft with greater total energy, and that aircraft decided whether to combat or withdraw. This approach demanded discipline that contradicted every fighter pilot's aggressive instincts. When you dove on a Zero and missed, every instinct demanded pulling around to reattempt. You had just traveled 5,000 feet at screaming velocity. Your target remained present, and turning to re-engage felt natural. But that turn depleted all your speed. Suddenly, you existed in the Zero's energy state, slow and vulnerable. The Zero pilot who had been defensive moments earlier could now reverse the situation. Pilots who couldn't resist that temptation died. The throttle-down overshoot technique emerged from desperate situations where all other options had failed. You had lost your altitude advantage. A Zero had positioned itself behind you despite your best efforts. The weave wasn't feasible because your wingman was elsewhere combating his own engagement. Energy combat doctrine stated you should never be in this position. But combat represents chaos, and sometimes theory encounters reality in the worst possible manner. This is where pilots discovered that the throttle lever itself could become a weapon. Ensign James Sweaty accidentally discovered the technique on April 7, 1943, during a massive Japanese air raid on Guadalcanal. A Zero had attached itself to his tail after Sweaty had exhausted his altitude and speed advantages during a frantic engagement with dive bombers. He was hauling his Wildcat through violent maneuvers, but the Zero pilot matched every turn, creeping closer. Sweaty's aircraft was already damaged, losing hydraulic fluid, and he knew he had perhaps 30 seconds before those 20mm cannons penetrated his aircraft structure.